Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert for 40 days to be tempted by the devil. If I was Jesus, the first thing I would say is, thanks, Holy Spirit. I think sometimes we as Christians are even sometimes naive about this temptation and trial that comes our way. If I was just doing it right, if I was just following Jesus right, I wouldn't be having so many difficulties. Wouldn't be having so many temptations. No, actually, if you're doing it right, you will be tempted. Right? Jesus himself, the perfect Son of God, was tempted. So what's going on here in this reading? Jesus is reliving the temptations of Israel in the desert, in the Exodus, and in himself he is being faithful while Israel was unfaithful. Why? So that we can be faithful in the midst of our temptations. And the context of this is exceedingly important. What's the context? The context is Jesus was just baptized in the Jordan. The dove comes upon him. He hears the voice of the Father who says, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." And Luke goes on to give a little biographical note about his ancestry. And then it says, and he was led by the Spirit into the desert for 40 days to be tempted by the devil. Notice the character of the temptations. Every single one of them is an attack on his identity, the very identity that he heard from his Father. It's an attack against his sonship. Listen to the first one. If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. Second one. I will give you all this power and glory. It's after the devil shows him all these kingdoms. I'll give you all this power and glory, for it has been handed over to me if you worship me. The only reason why devil has any power is because we have forfeited it to him. This is an attack against him because Jesus is the one to whom all authority has been given. And Jesus was the one who was being sent from the Father to take the authority back from the devil and give it back to us. So this is a temptation against his identity. This third temptation, right? If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from this temple. God will protect you. Every single one of these temptations are against his sonship, against his identity. And today I want to zero in on this first temptation and relate it to Lenten penances. So this first temptation is this. If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread. Now Jesus is hungry. He's been there for 40 days. He has not eaten. The devil knows how to get to him. He's hungry. He's weak. If you're the Son of God, command this stone to become bread. What is this temptation really about? You're the Son of God. You can do this yourself. You don't have to wait on the Lord. You don't have to rely on the Father. You don't have to actually rely on his provision. Do something to make yourself feel better. Now the context here is very important because notice what Jesus responds. He says, what does he say? He says, one does not live on bread alone, but on every word which comes forth from the mouth of God. In the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, in the Exodus, the children of God were complaining about being delivered from Egypt. They were saying, we're going to die of hunger in this place. We're going to die of thirst. Would that we went back to Egypt where we had all this good stuff. They were filled with fear that they were going to die of hunger. And what does God do? God pours out manna from heaven. He pours out quail from heaven. And Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 8 that he did that to show them that it really isn't upon bread that man lives, but upon obedience to the word of God. The rest of the quote here is that one does not live on bread alone, but on every word which comes forth from the mouth of God. Israel was disobedient there. Jesus is trying to be obedient. He's trying to rely on the Father in everything that he's doing in this moment in the desert. And the devil is simply saying, rely on yourself, provide for yourself, make yourself feel better if you're the Son of God. You can do this feat. If Jesus tried to actually respond to the Father by relying on himself, he no longer would be acting as Son. See, his power came to the extent of his power came to the degree to which he was surrendered and completely submitted to the Father. He didn't have any power outside of the Father. I can do nothing on my own, Jesus says. This is a temptation against relying on God. And so it is with us. As sons and daughters of the Father, the moment we believe that we do not need God is the very moment that temptation is at our door. Allow that to sink in for a little bit. We live in a culture of orphans, of people who do not know the good Father who is providing everything for them. We live in a culture that does not want us to depend on God. It's saying, take care of yourself. You don't have to wait on Him. Make yourself feel better. And there's all these different things that distract us and that prevent us from allowing God to provide for us. And this can be a very real temptation for us. Now, one of the things that we need to admit to ourselves is that we often depend on ourselves. We do this all the time. And if we're honest, one of the reasons why we do this is because it's painful to rely on God. It's painful to be obedient to His word. Why is it so painful to rely on God? Just like Israel in the desert, why was that so painful? Because in order to rely on God, they have to confront the fear and the pain, the emotional pain that it actually takes to rely on someone else outside of oneself. It's far easier to self-medicate and to do self-reliance. In order to rely on God, we need to confront that pain in our hearts. And one of the things that we see is that if we keep running away from God or we refuse to rely on God in the midst of the pain, what happens? We don't see God provide for us. And when we don't see God provide for us, we can actually become cynical. I've seen this a lot as priests. People become very, very cynical because God isn't providing for them. But in reality, they're not allowing God to provide for them because they're actually taking over control of their life again. They're trying to provide for themselves. They're running back to Egypt. And then they complain that God never delivered them. I see this over and over again. I see this in my own heart. This happens to me. Yet the reality is that if we want God to provide for us, we have to be willing to confront our pain. And this is where our Lenten penances come in, especially the penances that have us denying ourselves food and drink or any other sense pleasure. When we give up food and drink, we need to remember that it is oftentimes that we go to food and drink. I'm talking about alcohol in particular, and even sense or sexual pleasure, to actually medicate the emotional pain that it requires for us to depend on God. And when we take that away, when we voluntarily take that stuff away that we use to prevent ourselves from really addressing that pain, what happens? The pain comes back. And it's an opportunity for us to meet God there in the fear, in the insecurity. And when we meet God there, we see that He is a faithful God who will never abandon us, who will give us everything that we need in the desert of our life so that we can actually reach the promised land. That's how good He is. And so when we're doing penance, we allow ourselves to go back to that place of, oh my goodness, this is very uncomfortable. And one of the things that's important, if we're honest with ourselves, is sometimes that if we're honest with ourselves, we can sometimes give in to stress drinking. Has anybody ever heard of that? When you're stressed out? It's not funny. You're stressed, right? And you maybe have a long day at work or some interactions at work, or maybe there's a relationship falling apart, or maybe there's a loss in your life, and you get home and you just have a drink just to relax. And there's something beautiful about alcohol that helps you to relax. The problem is this: you never actually resolved or addressed the thing going on in your heart. You just simply medicated it, you covered it up. And what happens is the next day, more and more stress comes upon you, then all of a sudden you realize, well, I just need another drink again. And it doesn't necessarily even have to become alcoholism. It just becomes one of those things where I just do this. Well, you never actually address what is happening, and so you become filled with anxiety and you don't trust in God. And as a priest, I can say this is something that I have struggled with. There's a lot of stressful things that happen in a parish, right? And sometimes it's just one drink. It's not a big deal. But I find myself not actually why am I not at peace? When I wake up in the morning, I never actually address the thing toward the end of the day when I had all this stuff. Oh, that's right. And the Lord convicted me of this. There was a situation that was very hard for me, and I just was like, oh man, I'm just so tired. And it's just, and Father Joe and I just sat down, hung out, and I never went to God. I went to the glass of wine. And what's interesting is that when God convicted me of that, I said, Lord, this is really what's I've been struggling with. And I gave him that. And you know what he said to me? He said, I'm going to take care of that. I love you. Rest in me. And the heaviness and the emotional pain lifted. And I didn't actually feel like I needed to have anything else. It was amazing. Sometimes this happens with eating. Sometimes psychologists call this emotional eating, right? We have all these emotions, right? Maybe it's guilt, or maybe it's feeling of rejection or loneliness or depression. And what we do, rather than actually addressing it with God and getting his view on this, Lord, what do you think about this? Lord, this is what the temptation is. This is what my fear is. And getting input, what do? We go right to the food. And the food, again, gives us this temporary feeling of relief, but in reality, we are not actually dealing with the problem. We're running away from trusting in him. We run to the food or the drink or the sex or the whatever it is to give us what we desperately need from God. This is what was happening to Israel. And this is what Jesus was being tempted to do. Provide for himself, make himself feel better. But when we open this up to God, it is really powerful. And I just want to give you a little bit of what that looks like. When you're fasting, when you're choosing not to eat before you go to bed, you're choosing not to drink, or you're choosing to fast from that thing that you really, really want, and you have that pain, say, Lord, I don't need that. I need you. I need your love. This is what's going on in my heart. I'm not going to run away from my pain. I want to run to you in my pain so that you can show me who you are in it. And it's precisely there that you will experience healing, restoration. And some of you might say, Father, this sounds very familiar. This is the type of stuff we talked about on the Healing the Whole Person retreat. I want to encourage the parish to consider reading a book called Lenten Healing. It's a book that actually goes through every single day of Lent, and it goes through the different wounds and sins of our lives and shows us how to pray through them. This is the book here. There was a woman that endorsed this book named Sister Miriam James Heedland. She's giving our vicariate mission starting tomorrow night. Highly recommend that you read this. My brothers and sisters, Jesus teaches us it's okay to be dependent on God. It's okay to be emotionally vulnerable to him. Why? Because he's faithful and he wants to restore us. If we do penance in such a way that allows him to provide for us, then we can be free from it. And then we can realize that it is only by relying on him that we will be strong enough to reach the promised land, where we will never hunger again.